I understand that you were a farm manager. Can you tell us about what all about it?
Yes, I came in January 1982 to be farm manager at West Lane Farm, Shillington and Pound Farm at Ickleford. Strangely enough, it was a very, very snowy January, and the snow had brought down a number of dead elms, so I spent the first few weeks clearing dead elms from the wheat fields.
Where did you live?
We lived in Burgen Lane, number 1 Burgen Lane, which had been refurbished from an old cottage and was probably about 50 yards from West Lane Farm. It was a tied cottage linked to the farm. When I was made redundant 20 years later, the agricultural restriction was lifted and it was sold as an ordinary dwelling for a great deal of money.
Who lived in the house with you?
My wife, Bet, and 2 children, David and Laura. When we came, David was, he'd be 3 years old, and Laura was just 1 year old. And they obviously spent most of their childhood at Burgen Lane. In fact, David eventually used to be the harvest help in the grain stores both at Ickleford and at Pirton, which was actually a godsend, because he was far, far better than any other student, because we could converse and he was keen to do the job, whereas students were not. And it was always a problem. You would go in and say, right, what's the moisture? The student would say, oh, I don't know. The critical thing to know when grain is going into a bin, what is the moisture? So you know whether you've got to dry it or whether just to aerate it. In the very hot years, grain would come in very, very warm. So the first thing you had to do was cool it down by blowing overnight. If you didn't, you would get condensation, which equals moisture, which equals the bin would go wrong.
What were these buildings that you had then at West Lane Farm?
We had a grain store with 12 54-ton bins, so storage for about 650 tons of grain, a machinery barn for storage of fertiliser, machinery, seed, a spray store, properly bunded, properly made specially for storing sprays, and a workshop for the inevitable breakdowns and trying to sort of weld things up to get by.
Can you tell me about the amount of land that you had? What sort of land did you have in Pirton specifically?
In Pirton specifically, at West Lane Farm there were 110 acres. Then at Shillington there were a further 76 acres. And then at Pound Farm there were about another 300 acres scattered round the village. Much of the land of Pound Farm, which was originally next to the shop by the Ickleford Way, the original pound farm, a lot of the fields had been sold for development. Old Hale Way, many of the roads in Ickleford were built on land that used to be pound farmland. It left very small odd fields dotted about the village, very difficult to farm because you were either three sides with houses, or you were next to an allotment, or you were next to a watercourse. So, and you got people walking through all the time on the footpaths. One field was literally surrounded by footpaths.
Did you have the same problem in Pirton?
Not the same.
Which fields? What names were the fields? Where
Well,
were you farming?
we called the field in front of the barns West Lane Field, 26.5 acres. The next one to the east, up against the Holwell Road, was Dog Leg, which was 30 plus something acres, part of which was the old sewerage farm. And then the big field at West Lane was called, not very originally, but 55 acres. I think you know it as Northfield. There was always a problem that there was the ditch, which was the responsibility of the Ivell Drainage Board, and you had to be very careful when spraying that you left the right margin against a watercourse which eventually flows into the River Hiss. In terms of problems with housing or people, straw burning was the only time you really had to worry. And the problem certainly with West Lane and Dogleg is that you had to have the wind in an easterly direction. The prevailing wind is southwesterly. You had to wait just for the right time and then literally dash to burn the stubble. And of course, stubble burning helped to control blackgrass, which is now one of the biggest problems farmers face.